Good morning, everyone. We're at 9:30, so the hearings can resume. You'll have noticed that I'm on my own today. Simon Barclay is otherwise engaged for the rest of this week, so it's just me today, tomorrow, Thursday and Friday. I've probably double counted there, but never mind. For the rest of the week, let's put it like that. I'll begin as we usually have by asking Carol to deal with the announcements. Go on.
Morning. As usual, there's no scheduled fire alarms programme for during the inquiry, the examination. So if alarm does sound, please make your way to the nearest exit and gather on the corner of Claremont Terrace outside the GMB building, which is just to your left as you go out the main doors. Do not stop to retrieve any belongings, but exit the building as quickly and safely as possible, following the green fire exit routes. Do not enter the building until a fire marshal or member of the fire service tells you it's safe to do so. Please only use the main doors at the front to access and exit the building. For security purposes, do not use the side doors unless you're a wheelchair user and there is someone available to unlock and relock the door after you. Just to make people aware, there are other users in the building who are having language classes, so there will be other people knocking about. The toilets are situated on the ground floor in the corridor adjacent to the main room, just to that side. Water is available in the main hall for the attendees and in the foyer for members of the public. So if anyone in the gallery needs any water, you get down here in the foyer. Other refreshments are available on Gilly Gate, where there's a good coffee shops and places to get something to eat. And there's also a Sainsbury's Express in Bootham. Also to remind you that the proceedings are being filmed, so if anyone does have any issues, just let me know and I'll make sure you're seated somewhere where you're not going to be picked up on camera. The Wi-Fi details are Citadel Guest and the password is General Booth 1883, and those details are available at either side of the room on the posters. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. As you all know, today is Matter 7, Transport and Air Quality. I just wanted to make a couple of small points before we get on to that. Questions 7.1 to 7.4, we'll deal with them in order. I hope. I recognise there might be some overlap, but ideally I'd like to deal with transport first and then move on to air quality. The main point I want to make, though, at the outset is that transport and air quality issues may well have been discussed when particular sites were covered in previous hearings. Generally speaking today, I'm trying to think about it on a plan-wide basis. So it's plan effects that I want to try and examine, though I understand the difficulty we may need to get into specifics about specific sites, but I'd rather not stray too far into that. There's nothing more I really need to say. So, Mr. Elvin, I'll invite you to start off.
So just by way of background, firstly, as you know, we presented a fair amount on transport and infrastructure in Phase 2, and Mr. Ridge explained the relationship between transport planning and the local plan there. I'm going to ask him in a minute just to reiterate that briefly for those who didn't hear it the first time, and in particular the relationship with the developing transport strategy. You will have, in addition to the hearing statements, you'll have a note from Mr. Ridge dated the 5th of September 2022, which has been on the examination website for a week or so, which just explains how forecasting is done, sets out departmental guidance and the relationship between local forecasting models and the department and National Highways forecasting as well, and how the two interrelate. You'll also have a presentation document explaining the transport strategy. I'm going to then just turn to, and I should also say various changes are proposed to most of the T suite of policies other than T9, and they start in the schedule at page 196. or 195, the introduction, and it contains a series of minor tweaks and some more major ones, which are there to accommodate a number of the comments that have been received from those making representations to the plan and to improve the operation of the plan. Of course, Mr. Ridge will address any of those should they be problematic. Mr. Ridge, can I turn over to you, hand over to you, and just get you to explain the relationship between the plan, how the plan has approached growth, what the alternative scenarios that were considered were, the relationship with the transport strategy, and then briefly with national forecasting, please.
Of course.
These all go to question 7.1, I should have said.
Yes. I've got some sort of general introductory remarks. My name's Julian Ridge. I am the Sustainable Transport Manager for City of York Council, which means I look after walking and cycling, transport policy, public transport, road safety, and the travel behaviour change unit that we have in the city. I want to say a little bit firstly about impacts of the local plan and the growth foreseen in the local plan, and then a little bit about the mitigations that the council is taking forward. So in terms of impacts, the evidence that's presented in the council's hearing statement relating to question 7.1 sets out that the council in general consider the impact of the local plan on transport in York to be acceptable. But in saying this, we should be very clear about what we are considering. There have been some suggestions in hearing statements from the parties in this room that all of the growth seen in the modelling work that we've done behind the local plan is related to the local plan. But I think it's very important to remember that we're not considering the impacts of growth in York per se, but here we're talking about the impact of the spatial distribution within the local plan. And that's something that is different from the general impacts of growth on transport. It's inevitable that because York's an attractive place to live and work, there will be growth in population, employment and a number of households in York over time, and that this will inevitably cause a growth in trip making across the city. The modelling work that we presented in EX 87, 87A and 91 makes it clear that the pattern of development in the local plan does not impose impacts on York's transport network that are significantly better or worse than alternative patterns of development. Overall impacts against the base 2019 position are, in our view, not severe. And as such, we consider that the mitigations set out in the infrastructure delivery note, which was uploaded to the examination library as EX-CYC 79, show that the impact of the local plan development pattern in comparison to other development patterns which could go forward in York are not significant, and that impacts against the 2019 position are not severe. And as a way to try and visualise that, the modelling work that we've done shows a typical AM peak journey time in York, which in 2019 was a 12-minute journey, 2 minutes of which would be spent queuing, 10 minutes would be spent in free-flowing traffic, will turn into a 13-minute journey in which 3 minutes are spent queuing, and 10 minutes are in free-flowing traffic in 2033. So this this underscores a key point about having a local plan, which is that adoption of the local plan will allow an effective coordination of policies to mitigate traffic growth, set modal shares and green travel plan commitments for developments in a way that would not be possible without a local plan. So having a local plan in itself is a very important part of our mitigation. In a situation where it was not possible to bring forward some of the interventions set out in the infrastructure delivery plan, for example, the bus mode shares and active travel proposals for the largest strategic sites, because the local plan was not adopted, then the adverse impacts of York's development on the transport network would be more significant and more severe than they are forecast to be. There's also been a suggestion that some of our modelling doesn't take account of developments outside CYC's boundary. Actually, that's not true, because the traffic growth forecast that we use, the Tempro data set provided by the Department for Transport, is a regional and national data set, and therefore growth outside of York's boundaries is implicit within Tempro. These growth forecasts sit behind the Visum transport model that we used to make the forecasts, and so they are accounted for in the traffic growth forecast that we have made. There's been an assertion that we're underplaying some of the traffic impact because the DFT's own traffic growth statistics suggest that traffic growth is higher than the stats that we have cited. We reject this view, and information on that has been uploaded to the examination library under EX-CYC 112.
That was the note I was referring to earlier,
Yes.
the 5th of September.
Yes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about transport strategy in York and the interventions that we're taking forward to the city. And again, we need to be really clear about what we are considering here. Transport in York enjoys a very vibrant stakeholder environment because there are many groups in York who are very actively interested in transport. As such, transport is a topic of very frequent debate in York. And as a council, we're very grateful for the scrutiny this places on our transport policies and our planning activity, and we're grateful for the many suggestions made by the various groups in the city about how York's transport network might be organised and developed in the future. But the local plan examination is for considering the impact of the development set out in the local plan, not transport policy in York more generally. I'm lucky in City of York Council's Transport Department to be supported by and work alongside many talented and hard-working people. We take our duty of care to the city very seriously. As we say above, we've modelled the transport effect of the spatial distribution of the growth in the local plan alongside our proposed transport interventions and assess it to be acceptable. And this is set out in EX-CYC 87, 87A and 91. The infrastructure required to mitigate the impact of the local plan is set out in the infrastructure note EX-CYC 79. We believe that the initial spatial sustainability appraisal of sites and the most recent traffic impact modelling and our infrastructure note discharges the Department for Transport's 2015 NPPF transport evidence requirement. We are now developing a new local transport strategy for York, which we wish to consult on in the autumn. But we make the point that this is additional to the information that we have put forward in the local plan, and it's supporting the carbon strategy, which is uploaded to the library as EX-CYC 104, and the economic development strategy, EX-CYC 103, both of which have been developed subsequent to the local plan. The interventions posited in the infrastructure delivery note, however, because we believe that the transport impact of the plan with the interventions posited in the infrastructure delivery note is not severe, we do not believe it is necessary to withhold judgment on the soundness of transport policies in the local plan until development of a new local transport strategy, as some of the parties in this room have suggested. Furthermore, such a strategy, if developed now, could not in practice be adopted until it is converted into a statutory local transport plan, which would be in spring 2024 at the earliest. We think this is an unacceptable delay to the adoption of the local plan. As such, we do not believe that it is necessary or feasible to present a detailed transport strategy for the plan to be assessed as sound and adopted, and that the measures set out in the infrastructure delivery note will cost-effectively limit the impact of development in York. Finally, I would say that York remains, or has been for many years, and remains a very progressive transport authority. We are active in delivering measures which deliver modal shift and traffic reduction in the city. In the last 5 years, we've delivered a new river crossing for cyclists and pedestrians on Scarborough Bridge. We're developing improvements for pedestrian and cyclists on Tadcaster Road and launching a local cycling and walking infrastructure plan. All our 4 major schemes being taken forward contain significant active travel improvements. This year, we won £35 million to electrify and improve our bus network. Last week, our transport model won the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transportation's Transport Planning Award. Levelling up, devolution and a low-carbon focus expected for the 4th round of local transport plans all offer opportunities to attract funding for measures to mitigate traffic impacts of development of the city. These are, by and large, above the mitigations set out in EX-CYC 79 and the modelling presented in EX-CYC 87. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reid. Was there anything else that the Council needs to put forward at this stage? No. Who would like to start off the discussion? Mr. Merritt.
Thank you. I'd like to raise some issues regarding the evidence base to start with, because I think they're fundamental to this morning, and Mr. Ridge has already touched on some of those issues. And at the heart of this is the DFT guidance for the production of the existing, transport evidence base for this local plan. It is quite detailed and extensive, and it is pretty clear to us that the Council has simply not followed the guidance. And therefore, this is a fundamental question of the soundness of this plan. Para 004 of the guidance says an assessment of the transport implications should be undertaken at a number of stages. A, as part of the initial evidence base, B, as part of the options testing, and C, as part of the preparation of the final submission. We can see in the Council's evidence base, C, we can see no evidence in the Council's documentations that A or B was carried out. Now, it may be that some efforts were made to do it, but there is no documentary evidence to show that. Para 003 has 7 bullet points which flags the issues that the transport assessment and evidence base should look at. And it is quite consistent through those that it requires the Council to look at all modes and freight. And again, we are in the situation where the evidence base is primarily focused on the highways traffic issues and does not assess in the way that is actually required in the document, which is to look at the impact on all networks, not just the highways, that they have not done that in terms of either the public transport or the walking and cycling networks. Para 005 details what the transport assessment should actually cover in 6 bullet points. And I think it's worth looking at the first of those bullet points, which says all current transport issues as they affect all modes and freight.
Sorry, what's Mr. Merritt looking at, please?
The DFT 2015 guidance on the evidence base, transport evidence base for local plan making.
Have you put it in, is it in the documents? Because I need a document number, Mr. Merritt.
It's government guidance. It's
Well, it doesn't matter. It should be in the examination library if you're relying on it.
Oh, I don't have the number off the top. I'll look it up when I've finished and come back.
Well, I need to look at it while you're talking about it, Mr. Merritt. You know the rules well enough. You've been here for several months.
I think in fairness, Mr. Merritt, I'd like to be able to look at it while you're talking to it as well.
Me too.
Right. numbered virtually every other document with the references, and I didn't do this one. Typical.
Is it the guidance on transport evidence bases in plan making and decision making you're referring to, Mr. Merritt?
Yes, that is correct.
Right. March 2015.
Yes.
Fine. Right.
The quickest way is actually going on
I
the
don't know.
government site, frankly.
You know, Mr. Merritt, I've found it. It's just making sure the inspector's got it as well.
Yeah. Do you have the reference then?
Yes. It's, if you just search transport evidence bases in plan making, it's on the government website.
Yeah, that's what I've been using.
I'm sorry, Mr. Merritt, it's just so we can
Yeah,
follow
I
we can
apologise.
follow what you're saying.
As I say, I've referenced all the other documents and I didn't do this one. Just thought it was so fundamental. Yeah.
Okay, carry on. I've got it.
Right, it's paragraph 005 on, and it's the first of the bullet points. All current transport issues as they affect all modes and freight, covering, for example, accessibility, congestion, mobility, safety, pollution, affordability, carbon reduction across the whole plan area and within relevant areas of the plan, including existing settlements and proposed land allocations. And I think you ought to read that in conjunction with paragraph 002, where it says in the first paragraph, a robust evidence base will enable an assessment of the transport impacts of both existing development as well as that proposed. And I think that contradicts Mr. Ridge's comments earlier, where he was suggesting that we don't necessarily have to look at existing development. It is quite clear it needs to be a fully comprehensive transport assessment. There are other paragraphs in there that do not appear to have been done. In paragraph 005, number 5, where it says the scope and options for maximising travel planning and behavioural change, as far as we can see, is not addressed in any of the council documents. And the accessibility of accessibility of transport nodes such as rail bus stations to facilitate integrated solutions. And I think that's another key aspect. You know, there has been a considerable tendency for the council to look, in effect, in silos at highways, buses, walking and cycling, whereas the transport plan needs to actually take a holistic approach and look at all the issues, their integration, and those outcomes that I touched on earlier. And as I say, when I read out that list from bullet point 1, very few, less than half of the specific items that are listed there have been explicitly covered in the council's transport documents. At the end of paragraph 005, it says the transport assessment should be produced at a local plan level in partnership with all relevant transport and planning authorities, transport providers and key stakeholders, for example, the local economic partnership. Now, we are aware that the transport aspects were consulted with adjacent local authorities. There is evidence of that in the evidence base. And we are aware that some transport providers were consulted in respect of specific development sites. We are not aware that the transport assessment has been discussed and produced in partnership with any of those other organisations. There's no evidence in the evidence base that that has been done. Sorry, I should have said I'm speaking on behalf of York Environment Forum quite specifically in terms of this first intervention, although I am here to speak later on for another organisation. The Environment Forum has approached an environmental law charity in terms of pro bono advice. And in terms of the status of this guidance, as we understand it, it is not statutory guidance, but that does not mean it does not have power and import. The advice, I say advice, the response that we have had is, as you have realised, non-statutory guidance doesn't have the force of statutory guidance, but there is no authority for the proposition that they can therefore be ignored or entirely disregarded. Rather, there is a general public law duty to have regard to the guidance, the weight of which will be context dependent. They refer to the case Ali versus the London Borough of Newham in 2012, EWHC 2970, which I think ought to be added to the evidence base, and it sets out a useful checklist of things to be considered when determining the appropriate weight. And in paragraph 30 of that, it says Newham was, which I think is the summary of the decision, Newham was required to follow the national guidance unless there was good reason to depart from it. I think, I would like to ask on behalf of the York Environment Forum, and I hope the Inspector will also ask this question of the Council, what good reasons apply in such a heavily congested city like York, which suffers from air pollution, traffic-related air pollution problems that exceed the statutory limits, and where we face a climate emergency, for not actually undertaking the full comprehensive transport assessment that the guidance suggests should be done. It's not as if we haven't been pointing this out to the Council. It was in our original representation, and not just our original representation, in 2018. They have had 4 years to address this. There have been some partial attempts to recover the position, but we are still in the situation where we do not have a fully comprehensive transport assessment that meets the guidance, and a long way off it.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt. What do you suggest that means for the plan? I mean, that's a very blunt question, forgive me, but I think the points you make seem to me to be rather fundamental.
Yes, they are, and that's why we said the plan was unsound in the first place, why we have been pressing the Council to undertake this additional work. Now, I understand from some of the previous debates that you are likely to issue some major modifications which will effectively extend the timescale of this whole exercise by a fair period. We know that the Council has quite a lot of the information there. I mean, it has had people working on the initial work on the draft local plan. They have the initial work that was done for the walking and cycling strategy. We would hope that even at this late stage, the Council would make a serious attempt to remedy those things that are remediable at this stage in order to meet the guidance. We want to see a plan adopted, but we want to see one that has a sound basis that addresses the environmental, the carbon and other challenges that we have indicated in our evidence that are not being addressed at the moment, because this is a plan for further traffic growth, not a plan for managing it, not a plan for reducing the carbon impact of transport in this city, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt. I'm going to come to the council to respond to that. I think it's probably the best thing to do before we take things any further.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't agree with Mr. Merritt's legal analysis. He is confusing challenges in the courts with the judgment that you've got to reach as to the soundness of the plan, which is what the Ali case is dealing with. It's not correct that the implications were not undertaken in the preparation of the plan. Can I refer you once again to the Regulation 19 Sustainability Appraisal? You will find, as I've mentioned before, in Appendix J, an assessment of on a thematic basis of the issues in the plan. This includes at J11, beginning at page J144, the effects of transport policies T1 to T9. What the guidance says is the implication should be undertaken at a number of stages. The implications have been considered. You've also got in the sustainability appraisal in references I've given you already to the various stages of the plan and the sustainability appraisals carried out at each stage. This has been done for each of the thematic policies, including the transport policies. The transport implications of the other thematic policies have also been assessed, and you'll see that in Appendix J as well, as have issues in relation to carbon. So it is not correct that there has been a failure to follow the guidance. The more detailed work, which has to be done as part of the final submission, has been done, and you have seen a large amount of material, and I'm going to ask Mr. Ridge just to comment on this in a moment. It is, as with sustainability appraisal, an iterative process. Changes have been made, further information has been brought forward as part of that iterative process. And what is important is that you are satisfied that the position that has been reached by a proper consideration of the traffic and environmental implications of the plan. There have been many misunderstandings about the sustainability appraisal and its elements, and I addressed a number of those mounted by Fulford in a written note early in these phases of the inquiry, as you'll recall. We don't accept, therefore, that Mr. Merritt is right. Whether or not he would have preferred to see the amount of detail that's been produced for the final stage at the first stage, frankly, is not a matter for him. It's a matter for the judgment of the authority and eventually you in determining that the information you now have with regard to the implications of the plan is sufficient for you to reach a judgment on soundness. With that in mind, I turn to Mr. Ridge just to deal with the question of whether the local authority has effectively tried to skip work at earlier stages in the plan.
My view is that we have not done that. When the plan was presented in May 2018, it was accompanied by a detailed transport note, which was updated in 2019 and has been updated again for this stage of the examination and is submitted to the examination library as EX87 and 87A. That report looks at or those reports look at the detailed traffic impacts of the local plan spatial development. EX87A and EX91 also include a consideration of different spatial distributions of development and the impacts of those across the city as counterfactuals to appraise the local plan against the initial assessment of transport impacts calculated in probably 2016, 2017 as part of the early parts of the plan, fed directly into the policies T1 to T9 and the site-specific policies, particularly for the larger sites, which, as we discussed in phase 3 of the examination, contain ambitious mode shares for bus and active mode and commitments to provide quite large amounts of infrastructure to support that.
Mr. Merritt?
Can I make 2 points? One is that a sustainability assessment is not a transport assessment. It is a different process. And you know, the transport assessment guidance stands in its own right, and my arguments in regard to that stand. Mr. Ridge has referred to the transport topic papers and the more recent 87A document. They are basically highway trip assessment papers. They are not transport assessment papers or summaries of transport assessment papers in the sense of that the DFT guidance requires. And we've put quite a lot in our written submission, which I think identifies why even those late, carbon assessments and air quality, which frankly is scientifically illiterate, comments are not adequate. And we will come to the detail of that later in not just our submission but others.
So can I just add to that? Mr. Merritt, again, with all respect to his submissions, falls into error. There is nothing that prevents the transport implications, which are what the transport guidance requires to be assessed, there's nothing that prevents it being included as part of the overall sustainability appraisal. There is no legal requirement for a separate or independent transport assessment. What the guidance says, and you'll see this in paragraph 1, paragraph 2, paragraph 3, is that the transport implications are properly considered and that a robust evidence base is provided for the plan. Just as you can combine a sustainability appraisal with a strategic environmental assessment, there is no reason why this guidance can't be met by the sustainability appraisal. And that is what has been done. Moreover, if you look at the opening paragraph of the transport note EXCYC 87, it specifically references the national guidance that Mr. Merritt has referred to. Julian, did you want to add something? No, thank you.
Thank you. Well,
Can I draw the inspector's attention then to paragraph 006, which details the information that is required for the transport assessment of the local plan. And you'll see that there's a lot of information that is called for there, which I do not believe is in the sustainability assessment at the level of detail that the DFT guidance requires, as well as the other paragraphs that I previously referred to.
And my response to that is, firstly, this is considerations that could be included. It's not mandatory. Secondly, it's based on existing data. It says much information required will already be available. And it doesn't mean that it has to be included in vast detail at every stage of the plan. The question is by the time you get to what Mr. Merritt has described as C, which is the preparation of the final submission, whether you are satisfied that you have a robust evidence-based base considering the relevant considerations which apply here. And I'm going to ask Mr. Ridge if he'll just give his view about the list that's set out in paragraph 6 of the guidance and the extent to which these issues have been considered. I don't want about vast detail, but...
Apologies, I was just finding the reference. Well, in terms of the baseline existing conditions, those have been considered in the modelling. Existing integrated transport networks and any gaps in these as well as service and quality. That's been considered in site-specific policies and policies T1 to T9. Opportunity to change to other forms of transport considered in policies T1 to T9. Current use and demand by all different types of transport, including cumulative trips into and out of the area. That's been considered in the modelling. Availability of information from travel plans, previous assessments, transport operators, etc. is considered through the consultation and sustainability appraisal. Capacity data on rail and tram networks and constraints across the area, considered through the sustainability appraisal. Walking and cycling facilities, considered in policy T5. Description of functional classification of the road network is implicit within the modelling. Traffic flows, implicit within the modelling. Parking facilities and park and ride, implicit within the modelling. Journey purpose of trips, implicit within the sustainability appraisal. And identification and assessment of key links and junctions on the highway network to establish existing conditions is within the traffic model. Committed network improvements, the infrastructure delivery plan, personal injury accident records, including cyclist safety, that's considered within the sustainability appraisal. Programmed public transport improvements, including timing and promoter information, is within the infrastructure delivery plan. Pollution, including baseline carbon emissions, broken down by type of travel, considered within the environmental policies and air quality policies. Existing transport-related environmental impacts are the same. Establish best practice in transport provision and share of each type, assessed within the sustainability appraisal. And at a broad level, journey purpose and origin destination currently and how this is likely to change or desired to change is within the model. So there's been an extensive amount of transport evidence marshalled as part of this plan. I think one thing that is also important to remember about this guidance is that the vast majority of planning authorities are second-tier local authorities who will not have the traffic evidence and capabilities at their fingertips that York has. You know, we are taking this forward. We're perhaps unusual as a traffic model, we are unusual as a planning authority because we are also a transport authority, and therefore we have things like network-wide models that would not necessarily be expected of most planning authorities.
So in simple terms, you're content that everything in this list has been covered in one place or another?
Yes, it's one of these instances where the plan has to be taken in its entirety, but we have covered all of these areas, and I'd be happy to provide a written response setting out where they can be found.
Well, I think I'm not sure I need that. I'm content with both of your positions. Does anyone have a similar point to make? Sorry, I can't read your nameplate. It's carry on, Mr. May, isn't it?
So I think it's a similar point, but I wanted to come back really to the detail of your first question, 7.1. I'm speaking on behalf of York Civic Trust. Just a couple of brief points in introduction. First of all, sir, you will have seen as one of our submissions our draft statement of common ground, and you might wonder why a draft has appeared without the council's signature. I just wanted to make clear that this was a document we were invited by the council to produce in early June. We produced it with the intention it would be tabled for matter 3. It took the council 2 months to respond, and we got the response a couple of working days before the deadline for phase 4. Rather than spend further time, we thought it better that you were aware, sir, of our understanding of the large number of areas where we agree with the council and those where we beg to differ. The second point, by way of introduction, and I'm sure you will have heard this in earlier hearings in phase 4, we submitted our responses as late as we could on the 29th of August. It was only a day after your deadline that the really substantial changes to policies T1 to T9 were submitted, and only a couple of days later that we had the Council's answers to your questions, and only last week did we have CYC 112, which frankly, sir, I have had no chance to study. It places us in a difficult position. It places you, sir, in a difficult position. It does unfortunately mean that I have to spend longer talking today because much of what I said in our submission on the 29th of August has to be updated. So I hope you'll accept that I might have to speak for a bit longer. Before I start on answering your question, I just wanted to flag forward because you asked Mr. Merritt what he would suggest. And we have a couple of suggestions for the way forward in a situation where we are clear that the appropriate assessment has not yet been made. We know there isn't a latest local transport plan, and we think we can suggest a way in which you can move forward, sir, while the Council, with support from others, addresses those concerns. But I'll come back to that, if I may, in question 7.2. Question 7.1, you ask really, I think, two questions. First of all, will the transport impacts be within reasonable bounds? And secondly, can appropriate improvements be undertaken within the transport network which effectively limit those significant impacts? And if I may, I'll take those separately. On the first of them, we have really 6 points where we are not satisfied that the impacts are within reasonable bounds. The first is that CYC 87A it focuses solely on travel times and delays. It says nothing about the resulting impacts on carbon emissions, air pollution, casualties, levels of accessibility. What it does show is that car journeys are expected to be 25% higher than today, and bus journeys, public transport journeys, 4% lower. And it clearly, therefore, suggests that all is not well. In terms of travel times and delays, it predicts values which, as we see it from our comparison, travel times about 20% higher than in the 2019 transport topic paper, and travel delays about 60% higher. And the transport topic paper 2019 was already saying that travel times were going to be 36% higher than today, and delays 65% higher than today. So taken together, those two documents suggest very significant increases in travel time. Now we have later papers that take that analysis to task from the Council, and I wanted to come back to those in a moment. But that's our first point, that in terms simply of travel times and delays, the Council's own documents and its consultants' predictions suggest that there would be serious impacts. CYC 91 does at last begin to produce some figures for carbon and air pollutants. We wanted to come back to the question of air pollutants in questions 7.3 and 7.4 because, frankly, scientifically, the analysis of oxides of nitrogen is unduly simplistic. But crucially, what CYC 91 does is to look at the impact of the plan. It does not look at the impact in 2033 if this level of development had not taken place. And therefore, it's a partial answer to the question. We would expect by 2033 CO2 levels to have fallen as a result of electrification of vehicles. whatever happened with the pattern of development, we would expect oxides of nitrogen to have fallen because vehicles are becoming less polluting. That comparison is not before you. The third point I wanted to make was, if we think about these impacts, we have to think about the Council's own targets. The Council, in para 3.12 of the local plan, already says it's important that future development does not lead to increased congestion. I've already suggested that the Council's own figures say that it does. We now have the climate change strategy, the draft, CYC 104, and that sets a target for a 25% reduction in person travel and a 33% increase in active travel in the 8 years that remain before the target date of 2030. And against that, we have a prediction of a 25% increase in car journeys. So fundamentally, the Council's own predictions are inconsistent with the Council's own targets in its climate strategy. And there's no getting away from that. The clear implication is those impacts will be severe. There is this interesting comment in para 714 of the Council's response, which suggests that the average peak journey time, and we've heard this from Mr. Ridge this morning, would only experience a 1 minute increase. Frankly, I'm afraid, sir, we have no idea where those figures come from, but they don't seem to bear any relation to either the 2019 Transport Topic Paper or the CYC 87A.
I don't know whether Mr. May recalls, if you'll forgive me for interrupting, but we went into this in considerable detail during phase 2. I can't remember whether Mr. May was here, but Mr. Ridge went through this at some length.
Thank you, sir. I was here for phase 2. I spent quite a bit of time contributing our expressions then. And as I recall, CYC 87A was not available in phase 2. Certainly CYC 91 was not. Neither was CYC 112.
No, but you had a detailed explanation from Mr. Ridge, which is consistent with what appears in the later documentation, Mr. May. And it might be better to address that than tilting at windmills.
Sir, with all due respect, I don't think the levels of increase in travel times and delays, the inconsistency with carbon targets are windmills. They are serious problems for the city, which the Council has not addressed. The final point I wanted to flag on this is the interesting analysis which comes in CYC 112, which as I say, frankly, I haven't had a chance to look at in any detail, that in some way the Department for Transport's figures of a 27% increase in travel over the last 8 years in York are wrong, and the Council's own figures of a 6% increase are right, and that somehow the Council has managed to get York to buck the trends of increases in travel at the levels predicted by the Department for Transport. If travel is not rising at that level, then it is bucking the trend, and it is almost certainly due to the impact of congestion. We only have to look at the specific example of Poppleton Bar, the one major road improvement over the last few years, where within 3 years, traffic entering the junction increased by 20%, to suggest that there is a threat here. There's an underlying problem of congestion, which is already severe, and there is a threat that if action is not taken, conditions will get seriously worse. So in answer to your first question, sir, our view is that without mitigation, the transport impacts will not fall within reasonable bounds. And then if I come briefly to the second part of your question, can improvements be undertaken? There's a bit of an argument from the Council, it appears to me, that they don't need to undertake improvements because there aren't going to be problems to be improved on. But it does, in the Council's response, it claims that sections 3 and 14 of the draft local plan show that the required improvements are deliverable, viable, and will be effective. That, frankly, totally misses the point of the NPPF requirements. The Council has made no attempt to assess what improvements are needed and demonstrate that the package that happened to be in LTP3 2011 is sufficient. There's therefore no basis, we would argue, for suggesting that the sets of measures proposed in policies T1 to T9 are either necessary to achieve those improvements or sufficient to limit the impacts, or indeed that the residual cumulative impacts will not be severe. So our feeling, in answer to the second part of your question, is we still don't know whether improvements can be undertaken which would cost-effectively limit these significant impacts, or whether the residual cumulative impacts would remain severe. And I just wanted finally, if I may, to come back to one point which has been made a couple of times this morning by the Council. And that's this question of what we're comparing with what. Mr. Ridge has focused on a comparison of what would happen in 2033 with the local plan pattern of development and what would happen without it, with development still taking place at the same scale but distributed differently. And I go back to, at this point, to DFT 2015, which we've spent a bit of time on this morning, and the critical paragraph 10, which says any proposed land allocation impact is considered in the context of two alternative scenarios, with development and without development, and thus enables a comparative analysis of the transport effects of the proposed allocation. What we have from the Council is something different. It's a comparison of one alternative, which is the local plan distribution of development, and a second, which is the same level of development distributed differently. That's not what the Department for Transport asked for. But I'll stop there, so I'm happy to answer questions or take further comments.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll hand over to the Council, I think.
Yeah. Can I just draw attention to the fact that the with and without is about the transport effects of the proposed allocations. That's paragraph 10. And Mr. Mayor, I would suggest, isn't entirely reading that correctly, but I'm sure Mr. Ridge has got more to say than that. But I do want to point out to Mr. Mayor, as I did in my intervention, that the issue, a number of these issues, was dealt with at length, and he simply appears content to avoid grappling with the explanations that were given in phase 2. Yes, it's true that other documents were then produced following that, but nonetheless you were given the explanation following the production of CYC 76, and you'll recall Mr. Ridge went through these features. Mr. May is also continuing to confuse the role of the local plan with the transport strategy, which I hoped we'd made clear earlier, and indeed we made clear in phase 2. However, I will hand over to Mr. Ridge to deal with those particular issues. Thank you.
I was hoping we'd be able to get through this morning without a detailed discussion of the contents of EXCYC 112, but nonetheless, I'm happy to go through it. EXCYC 112 was produced really in relation to these DFT statistics, and I think there's a point made by several people in their hearing statements that the DFT forecast, or the DFT figure for traffic growth in the York area, which is an increase of 27%, I think, over the 10 years to 2019, is in contrast to the figures that we produced in EXCYC 87, which was presented to phase 3 of the inquiry, which showed that traffic in York was broadly flat and was not growing over time. The suggestion that the DFT numbers should be used is something that we looked into, both in terms of the guidance on transport schemes called WebTag, and in terms of the information on the DFT's website about those statistics. They are very different from the statistics that we quoted in EXC 87, showing traffic in York was broadly flat. Our statistics are based on a network of automatic traffic counters which count traffic volumes 24/7 at a large number of places around the city's transport networks. The DFT statistics are by and large based on estimates. Very few of them had more than one data point over the time range that the statistics were collected for. And even the DFT itself says about these statistics, traffic figures at the regional and national level are robust and are reported as national statistics. However, DFT's traffic estimates for individual road links and small areas are less robust, as they are not always based on up-to-date counts made at these locations. Where more up-to-date sources of traffic data are available, e.g. from local highways authorities, this may provide a more accurate estimate of traffic at these locations. Having compared the two sets of data, we considered that the counts that we collect were more accurate than the DFT's estimates-based forecasting. There's a great deal more information about this in this note, should you want to review it.
That said, Mr. Ridge, can you confirm whether you simply ignored DFT Tempro forecasts on a regional and national basis?
No. DFT Tempro forecasts are absolutely essential to the modelling. When we talk about traffic forecasts increasing, or traffic volumes increasing in York by 25%, that is a figure based on the Tempro forecast. We have to use those figures to make our forecasts. We wouldn't be able to credibly bring forward a local plan transport appraisal that didn't use Tempro. Nonetheless, because the Tempro forecasts are based on those DFT estimates, which are higher than we see actually presenting on York's transport network, the high level of DFT growth is absolutely implicit within the traffic modelling that we have done, which is why we consider our traffic modelling to be a kind of worst case scenario test, a stress test of the network, if you like. We actually expect the level of traffic growth that presents on York's traffic network to be lower than that, and one reason for that is the large numbers of interventions that we take forward in the city.
Can I also ask you just to pick up the point that Mr. May raised, I think it was his third point, about inconsistencies in the climate change strategy CYC 113, paragraph 312 of the local plan, the 25% reduction that's being referred to, but 33% increase in travel. And he said there was an inconsistency in the approach of the council.
Again, the 25% increase is something that's forecast within Tempro, and we can't credibly not use that. The reduction that's sought through the carbon reduction strategy is something that we would like to see, but is not within the Tempro data set. So again, it underscores how the traffic forecasting we've done for the plan actually uses some very robust assumptions about growth, which we hope will not happen, but nonetheless, we felt it was prudent to test those assumptions of growth on the network to see what the impact of the plan would be. And just to add a bit of context about the comment I made about journey time increases and the increase from 12 minutes to 13 minutes, that was presented in phase 2 of the examination on the basis of the modelling work which had been done, I think, in 2019 for the original submission of the plan. We remodelled that for phase 3 of the examination, and the numbers that came out were not significantly different. Therefore, the journey time increase is broadly the same, I suppose, as you would expect. Seeing broadly similar growth projections modelled with broadly similar, although not identical, traffic models.
And Mr. May also seemed to be suggesting, he said there was a bit of an argument by the City Council that no improvements in transportation were necessary. Is that the approach of the City Council?
It is emphatically not the approach of the City Council that no transport improvements are necessary. As I said in my initial comments, we're one of the most progressive transport authorities in the country. We are currently taking forward hundreds of millions of pounds worth of transport interventions to improve transport in York, be that the improvement to the outer ring road, rebuilding the area in front of the railway station to make a better bus interchange, all the improvements at York Central. We are developing our local walking and cycling infrastructure plan with a view to radical improvements to the cycling and walking network. We've won £35 million of improvements to the bus network that will allow us to buy 44 brand new electric buses, plus a further £17.5 million of improvements more generally to the bus network that will be seen in terms of lower, simpler fares, more services, greater use of bus priorities, rebuilding the park and ride sites to become hubs that function, that allow people to catch interurban buses and make a difference to across the region. We're developing a new railway station at Haxby to the north of York. There is an awful lot going on. We have detailed plans that we are taking forward, much of which is well into implementation and funded.
I'm not going to pick up every single point, I don't want to be taken as having agreed anything, but which we don't. But can I just pick up the paragraph 10 point? If you've got the guidance in front of you, the 2015 guidance, we see that this approach typically applied when planning for local transport infrastructure, that's WebTag, and the project appraisal report system. Adopting this approach for local transport assessments will ensure any proposed land allocation impact is considered in the context of the two alternative scenarios with development and without development, and will enable a comparative analysis of the transport effects of the proposed allocation. When you have considered the various allocations that have been made in the plan and when they've been assessed in the sustainability appraisal, have you ignored the implications of the development on the do-nothing scenario?
No, we haven't ignored that.
And on what basis has mitigation and other policy suggestions been made for the sites which have been allocated?
The sustainability appraisal included a detailed appraisal of transport options to the individual sites, particularly the large sites which would be expected to have substantial traffic impacts. Those sites have very ambitious public transport mode shares. In many cases, we've identified large sums of money that will be used to support sustainable transport to and from those sites. An example in practice, I suppose, is the outline planning application that was made for York Central in 2019. As part of that, the Section 106 agreement, I think, and you'll forgive me if I don't get these numbers quite right because I'm trying them by memory, but I think there is a sustainable transport package behind York Central with a value of, I think, £4.8 million plus a further £2.3 million of measures should sustainable transport targets relating to how people access that site not be met. That funding covers a range of improvements to bus networks, walk and cycle networks, and then within the development itself, as part of the planning conditions for the site, there are various proposals to provide dedicated cycle routes, cycle lanes across the main, alongside the main access road, bus lanes within the development, and improvements to bus stops, shelters and other passenger facilities, all of which are not within those sums of money I've already named, because they are part of the development itself. So, if you wanted to see an example of our approach, particularly the approach that's set out in policies T1 to T9 in action, you could look at that Section 106 agreement and it would show you how we've levered in £4.8 million of development plus the further 2.3 option, plus probably another £3 or £4 million worth of enhancements that are just being delivered as part of the planning condition for the site.
Could you justify Section 106 provision, and could you justify the mitigation measures you've stipulated in the policies for the strategic allocations without considering the position without the development and the effect of the development thereafter upon the network and upon highway safety and other matters?
No, you could not. It's implicit in the way that we have managed to negotiate that settlement with the developers, and is also something that's implicit within the infrastructure delivery plan shown for the individual site allocations.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you both. Mr. May, you want to come back on any of that?
Could I come back very briefly? So, because I'm concerned we're getting into considerable detail here. You asked two specific questions, and I assume, sir, in response to Mr. Elman's first comment, you intended to ask them now rather than in phase 2, and therefore it's appropriate to be discussing them. The first is, will there be critical impacts? And we have before us the Transport Topic Paper 2019, CYC 87A, both of which, in terms of travel time and delay, suggest the answer is yes. We have very limited information on other impacts, but as I've argued, certainly in terms of the carbon dioxide trends, the answer again is yes. Now, we also have Mr. Ridge's interesting argument that actually these models are over-predicting the severity of the problem. And I would be happy to accept that to some extent they are. But we're faced with, if you like, two extremes. One is serious impacts, and the other is no impact of any severity, which is basically what the Council's argument is. I would suggest to you, sir, that the evidence we have before us suggests that there will be serious impacts unless action is taken, and therefore the key question, the second part of your question, is an appropriate set of measures being taken in the transport policies to address those impacts. And our view is we don't know because we've not seen that analysis. But we do think that it's possible to progress with the local plan, which we desperately want to do, and allow that question to be answered over the next few months or as a modification to the local plan at a later stage. And that's the point I wanted to come back to and offer, if you like, an olive branch